negotiate from a position of strength. It didn't happen that way. There wasn't a positive change from an American perspective in the war. And so efforts were redoubled in early 2018, not coincidentally, because you have a president who campaigned on and seems to still want the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan as a policy priority.
So, given that context, how consequential is the upcoming US presidential election going to be on the peace process? What are some differences we could expect from former years of Donald Trump versus a new Biden administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is very consequential, potentially, even though I'm not expecting a major change of direction if Biden wins. If Trump wins a second term, then based on the recent trajectory of the policy efforts, as well as the recent public statements by Trump himself and the tweets and his national security advisor's comments, which suggest a plan to reduce U.S. forces even more by another half, down to just 2,000 around there by January. I think it's a pretty safe bet that that would continue, and that the ability of U.S. diplomats to try to negotiate a decent political settlement will be much reduced if Trump wins, because the policy will be a policy about troop deployments, not a policy about Afghanistan. I mean, I think Trump has pretty clearly shown that, because he said, I mean, he really doesn't care about Afghanistan. He doesn't see the risk or threat there, or the issues of, U.S. credibility, or what do allies think about. I mean, it's really just about troops, no troops. So I think that you would see a push to just make as fast and dirty a deal as you can, so that you at least have a fig leaf for a complete withdrawal. If Trump loses and we have a question as to what happens in the period of time while he's still president after that loss. And there, I think we're all expecting, if Trump loses, to have all of the oxygen sucked out of the air by litigation of what the result of the election was. I mean, I'm not speculating, he's already, pre-litigated it, so he will post-litigate it too. And so the question in my mind then is, does he just lose interest in what he said about Afghanistan, and it's all really just about litigating the result of the election, literally and figuratively litigating? And is Afghanistan just off the radar and forgotten about, and nothing happens between then and the inauguration? Or does he decide he's just going to burn it all down, and that his legacy is I said I was going to do it, and now I'm just going to do it? That's possible to be too. I think the bureaucracy would have ways of slowing down anything serious that happens between the election and the inauguration, but not necessarily to a great degree. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that period. If we get through, if Trump loses and we get through the November to January period without too much happening, with the status quo being essentially preserved, then I think there's an opportunity for a Biden administration to do a bit of resetting. First of all, to kind of re-energize the peacemaking effort, which is right now pretty much stalled because of the U.S. election. Other factors too, but neither side in this negotiation is foolish enough to think they can count on what will happen after an American election. And so they're being very careful. They're not going to take any risk by entering into any agreements that they're not sure about. So things are stalled right now because of the election. If they stay stalled, there will be an opportunity for a Biden administration to re-energize its peacemaking efforts, to maybe repair some of the gaps, to probably take a little more time and be a little more orderly about it. I think they will still be focused on peace process, but the issues themselves are not going to get any easier, and the prospects of ultimate success in a peace negotiation are not going to be, orders of magnitude higher, even with a more orderly American foreign policy.
So there have been some efforts to imagine alternative histories of the war in Afghanistan, how U.S. strategy could have been implemented a bit better. Last year, Harris professor Ethan Mesquita wrote in the Boston Review that we were always going to lose the war in Afghanistan because, and I want to quote him here, counterinsurgencies are wars of attrition. Wars of attrition are won through resolve, and the side facing an existential threat will always have the greater resolve. He suggested that what could have been a successful, narrowly defined counterterrorism operation became unwinnable counterinsurgency. Moving forward, do you think the U.S. has learned the right lessons about counterinsurgencies?
Well, I mean, I largely agree with what you just described from that position, but with some caveats. Because, I'd want to know what that alternative looked like to getting embroiled in the counterinsurgency. To say we just go in, we topple the government, and then we say, see you later, that doesn't work particularly well either in terms of stable outcomes. So there's a lot to unpack about what that alternative history really looks like. In terms of whether the U.S. has learned the lessons, I'm not sure at all. I mean, I don't think the lessons have even been drawn fully yet about Afghanistan, much less learned. And what I think we've seen happen in recent years within the U.S. military establishment is simply sticking your fingers in your ears about counterinsurgency. It's like, oh, we just don't talk about counterinsurgency anymore. We don't do counterinsurgency anymore. We're not going to do it again. So why should we bother to think too much about what went right and what went wrong? I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly. I mean, the military does have its procedures for doing lessons learned, but it's only a partial exaggeration. I mean, I think there's just been such a rapid swinging away from the notion that we're going to ever again be in a counterinsurgency, just like happened after Vietnam, when it was like, well, we're not going to do that again. And then, lo and behold, we did do that again. That inhibits really learning the lessons. I do, what I do agree with is the idea that the United States could be a successful counterinsurgent in Afghanistan without the Afghans themselves being successful counterinsurgents. That to me is highly problematic. And if you look at the literature about counterinsurgency doctrine and the supposed success stories of counterinsurgency that the doctrine is drawn from, for the the successful examples are not of external powers being the primary counterinsurgents. They're of the internal power being the successful counterinsurgent. And so to me, that was the fundamental flaw of the U.S. Strategic approach to the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, was the idea that without the Afghans, that we could be the primary determinant of success in the counterinsurgency. Now, I don't mean to suggest that no one paid attention to the Afghan forces like that. There was also an effort to build up their capability, but I think there was a lack of realistic appraisal of how quickly and successfully you were going to be able to build up the indigenous Afghan capability to fight the counterinsurgency.
So finally, in the context of the peace process, you've talked about how any peace deal being brokered in the immediate future is highly unlikely, but what would a successful peace deal look like for Afghanistan? And part of the answer might be, depends who you ask, just based on the number of actors that are involved in it. But let's say, for example, if we look at Afghanistan and the U.S., how do we align our best case scenarios?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, to be clear, I'm a proponent of peace process in Afghanistan. And I think, the chances of success are not zero, and the payoff is high enough that the effort should be made, even if you can't say that the likelihood of success is high. From an American perspective, I think the bottom line needs to be what the Afghans themselves can agree to. So I don't think the U.S. should be that particular about what some of the details of a political settlement look like, even in terms of issues like, hot button issues like women's rights in Afghanistan. Now, I feel comfortable saying that because there's enough diversity of voices and participants that I don't think that anything that the current Afghan government would agree to would be too compromising on issues like that. But I don't think that the U.S. should have red lines about what the exact nature of the state and governance looks like. I mean, let's imagine, for instance, that the state structure that emerged looked a lot like Iran. Should we really have a negative view on that? It would be better than Saudi Arabia if it did. I mean, just to be realistic about it, it would be better than any of the monarchies in the Gulf that we're perfectly friendly with. It would, potentially even be not worse than Turkey. I mean, to my mind, the highest value is ending the violence and enabling Afghans to live their lives in relative peace. And from an American perspective, I think that in terms of the details of what the structure of the state and governance looks like, there's a lot that should be sacrificed for that highest value.
Well, Laurel, you've been very generous with your time today. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Well, it was my pleasure to join you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict featuring Laurel Miller. Special thanks to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of this series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit thepearsoninstitute.org and follow them on Twitter.